welcome to this seminar on Biden Summit for Democracy in the Shadow of Ukraine. It's really good to see you here. Welcome to you in the auditorium here at DIIS. Welcome to you who are following on the live stream. And then a special welcome to our three speakers, Rasmus, Richard, and Daniel, who I will shortly introduce properly. My name is Jon Clausen. I'm a journalist here at DIIS, and I will do my best to sort of bring us through the next hour and a half. So the program is as follows: that first we will hear from the three panelists, and then we will have a panel discussion, which I will do my best to moderate, and then there will be Q&A for the final 30 minutes. So that's the plan. But let me just introduce our three speakers, and let me start by introducing Daniel Hegedus. Daniel is a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund, and in his research he focuses on populism and democratic backsliding in Central and Eastern Europe, as well as the European and foreign affairs of the Visegrad countries. Daniel is frequently used as an expert by media such as the Financial Times, the New York Times, EU Observer, Der Spiegel, and among others. And prior to joining the German Marshall Fund, Daniel worked in different research and lecturing positions at the Freedom House, the German Council on Foreign Relations, and the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. And Daniel's presentation is titled Summit for Democracy Process, Central Europe's Missed Opportunity, ? Then we have Richard Youngs. Richard is a senior fellow in the Democracy, Conflict and Governance program at Carnegie Europe. His work is primarily focused on EU foreign policy and on issues of international democracy. Richard is also a professor of international relations at the University of Warwick, and prior to joining Carnegie in 2013, he was the director of the European think tank Friede. Richard has authored 15 books. His most recent work is Rebuilding European Democracy, Resistance and Renewal in an Illiberal Age. And Richard's presentation is called Is the Ukraine War a Catalyst or Obstacle to Global Cooperation or Democracy? And finally, we have Rasmus Sinding-Søndergaard, who's a senior researcher here at DIIS, where he focuses on US foreign policy, in particular the role of human rights and democracy promotion in American foreign relations. Rasmus is the author of the book Reagan, Congress and Human Rights from 2020, which traces the role of human rights concerns in US foreign policy during the 1980s. And his current work examines American visions for uniting the democracies of the world from the Cold War to the present. And that seems like a very relevant research area for this topic that we are going to address today. So without further ado, we will hear from Rasmus first, who will take stock of the Summit for Democracy. So Rasmus, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jon, and thanks to everyone for showing up here today. I will spare you any talk about the historical perspective and rather try to take stock of the summit. So I'll do three things. I will try to answer the question, what is the Summit for Democracy? Why did we have it? And what did it accomplish? So, what is it? I say what is it because it is ongoing. It is not a finished project, but rather an initiative that is continuing, and it is an American initiative to foster cooperation among democracies. I believe the correct figure of governments participating is 117 and not 120, but for the first summit there was 100 governments, and then they've had an addition of additional countries since, but worth to note that it's not purely a summit of governments, but one of representatives from civil society and the private sector. The first summit was held fully virtually by the United States in December 2021, And there the focus was on these three core pillars: defending against authoritarianism, fighting corruption, and promoting human rights. Then followed the so-called Year of Action, where participants in the first summit have worked on how to implement some of the roughly 750 commitments made by governments at the first summit. This has taken place in a variety of formats, including the so-called cohorts, where, as you can see, these are just some of them. The scope has been expanded quite a bit from the first summit, and so there has been work done on many aspects of democracy, and also a rather broad definition, you could say, of democracy compared to sort of traditional democracy assistance. And then we had last month, of course, the second Summit for Democracy, which was a hybrid event co-hosted by the United States, Costa Rica, the Netherlands, Zambia, and South Korea. And here the focus has very much been on sort of picking up the pieces from the previous year or so, and to showcase any progress made on sort of showing to the world how democracies can deliver. And then, of course, we have now a forthcoming third summit hosted by South Korea with further information to be determined. So, stepping back a bit, why a summit? I would say because of Trump, really. So Trump, Biden, and then sort of the sorry state of democracy worldwide. And, well, why is that? Well, Joe Biden, in his campaign in 2016, among his many issues on his campaign platform, was a promise to host a summit of democracies within his first year in governance. Why? Well, as I said, has something to do with the global state of democracy. At the time when Biden entered office, I guess it must have been 15 years of consecutive decline for democracy worldwide by then, according to Freedom House's measurements. So the backdrop is this global democratic recession, but the catalyst, I would argue, very much is stuff that happened domestically in the United States, personified in Donald Trump, who really accelerated some of the underlying structural issues in American democracy and made it clear that there was a need for sort of reinvigorating United States approach to democracy at home and abroad. At least that's how I see the Biden administration's approach. And therefore, the purpose of the summit and the sort of overall agenda on democracy from Biden has been to show that democracy can deliver for its people. This, of course, takes place within the broader framework of Biden's foreign policy, which has had a tendency to use the dichotomy of democracies versus autocracies. This is a framework that Biden has employed in many situations regarding Ukraine, Taiwan, and sort of in general as well. And the not so subtle subtext there, of course, is China. So the sort of emerging Cold War, new Cold War between the United States and Europe on the one side and China and Russia on the other. So this is, I believe, is sort of the origins story of why we have this summit. Just two quotes from the US National Security Strategy to illustrate the point. First one here really sort of summarizes the gist of this notion that the Biden administration sees the US as being engaged in this democracy versus autocracy struggle, and that here really the central sort of point in the struggle is to demonstrate which system is the best form of government, which system can best deliver for its people and the world. Important caveat, though, also in the same security strategy, the administration notes that the real issue from an American perspective is not autocracy per se, but it's autocracy combined with a so-called revisionist foreign policy. So the real issue from an American strategic perspective are those autocracies or authoritarian regimes who seek to uproot the existing order. So here again, to be explicit or to be concrete, the focus is on China and Russia as countries who are uprooting the existing rules-based order. Okay. What has the summit then accomplished? A lot of criticism. which I won't go into here, but we can go back to that in the discussion probably. There has been a lot of criticism from countries who weren't invited, from inside the United States, from academics, from civil society, from political opponents, and so forth. But if we try and be a bit more sort of on message, or be a bit more constructive, you could say that at the very least there has been some sort of message of democratic renewal, and from an American perspective, just as importantly, some emphasis on US leadership here. The sort of distinction between Donald Trump's foreign policy and then Biden's Summit for Democracy is pretty clear. Then there's been additional funding from the US, roughly $1.1 billion under the new presidential initiative for the renewal of democracy. We've seen numerous initiatives, which I can't go into here, there are too many of them, but on various subtexts connected to those cohorts that I mentioned before, with various countries sort of taking the lead on those. That could certainly warrant further discussion, but for now I'm just going to do the overall. Then we had a declaration at the end of the second summit, to which somewhat 70 or so out of the 117 countries so far signed on to. But it still leaves us with sort of the main question. So if the purpose of the summit is to renew the spirit of democracy and reintroduce the US as some leader in the area, then the question has to be, has it actually reversed this global democratic recession? And it may be unfair to expect that from two summits in a short time period. But nonetheless, if you look at Biden's statement at the second summit, he claims that what we're seeing now is that democracies are getting stronger, autocracies are getting weaker, and that is a direct result of the summit initiative. So, look at the data here, and I think we can get back to the data as well as in the discussion. But just 2 points to make here. Freedom House put out their annual Freedom in the World report, came out this year. They measured for 2022 the 17th consecutive decline for global freedom. They did note, however, that this was the smallest decline for global freedom in that 17-year period. So they point to the fact that there may be some form of leveling out of the decline. So it could be the beginning to the end of the decline, so to speak. Then we have the Economist's Intelligence Unit, which is another study that comes out annually. They claim that the story for 2022 is one of stagnation. So again, somewhat similar. They do, however, point to the fact that a lot of the explanation for this stagnation is the lifting of COVID restrictions in many countries. And so they are somewhat disappointed that the improvement in the democracy scores were not greater. So for now, at least, the data is pretty mixed, as one might expect. I would say in conclusion just that it's probably way too soon to measure the impact, and less is also, it doesn't have to be a complete reversal of the global democratic recession. That would be a tall order. But since that has been articulated by the Biden administration as the ultimate goal, I think it's fair enough to take stock at it. And for now, at least, we can't conclude too much on that. If we accept that there is a stagnation of the decline, then certainly other factors are also at play, as the two reports I just cited also point to. To the extent that the autocracies are getting weaker, I think it's primarily their own doing. Of course, you can look at individual countries, but if you look at China and Russia, they have done a lot in their foreign policy over the past couple of years to actually weaken their position. But I do want to say a few positives also on the summit. Again, taking the American perspective, I think that what Biden has done is he has initiated an important and necessary dialogue on how to improve cooperation among democracies, along with, of course, many concrete initiatives that are still taking place. Also, he has approached the area of the topic from a position of humility, with no small sort of amount of attention paid to America's own shortcomings, which I think is a refreshing and frankly rather new phenomenon when it comes to the US and democracy promotion. There's also been a multilateral approach by including co-hosts for the second summit and now turning over the initiative to South Korea. And of course, civil society has been included. And finally, I think I just want to point to the sort of for democracy part, right? So it has been a summit for democracy, not one of democracies, suggesting that it is an aspirational process in which democratic forces from non-democratic countries can also partake, as they have, and sort of pointing to that democracy itself is an ongoing process, rather than announcing the formation of a club, of an alliance of democracies that would imply that everyone else are not. So there's a bit more of a aspirational approach there that I think is the right way to go about it. But still, one has to ask, given the amount of resources that's been poured into the summit, not least the time of the president and his senior staffers, and also the same for other participating countries, there's been a lot of resources poured into this initiative. It's fair to ask whether it's the best approach to strengthen democracy. Does it provide the best forum for addressing global challenges? Of course, the summit aims to address global challenges such as climate change, etc. But is that really the way to go about global challenges, to bring together a bunch of democracies and leave out the rest? And does it improve relations between countries here in the north and in the west, and those in the so-called global south? I think there's suggestions that maybe it does not provide the best forum for that kind of collaboration in a future multipolar world order. So I'll leave it at that, and thereby sort of having hopefully introduced the basics of the summit for those who might not be familiar, and also opened it up to some of the questions that we can discuss later on. But I'm going to hand over the floor now to the next speaker. So
Thank you.
thank you. Yep.
Rasmus. Yes, next speaker is Daniel. And I'll just scroll back the slideshow here, so we won't be seeing your conclusions all the way, because Daniel might have other ones. Let's see.
I will question that conclusions at the end. Yeah.
I'll leave it here.
I think I don't have a presentation, so potentially I will just remain here.
Yep,
Thank you so much for having me and for the invitation. The title of my talk, I wouldn't call it presentation, is the Summit for Democracy Process, a Missed Opportunity for Central Europe. And I would like to start with a disclaimer to explain why is a Central European position or look on the Summit for Democracy process relevant, not only for me, who is leading a Central Europe program, but general from a broader Western perspective. And I think we can claim three good reasons for that. The first, that the Central and Eastern European countries have played a rather significant role over the past, I would say, 5 to 10 years in setting the agenda of transatlantic relations between the United States and the European Union. And especially since last February, Central and Eastern European countries, the Baltic states, Poland, Czechia, Slovakia, are obviously punching above their weights in determining the European policy to transatlantic relationship. Second, Central and Eastern Europe is a small-scale model, or I can also use the word petri dish, of global autocratization. Central and Eastern Europe is the fast autocratizing part of the globe, now for, I would say, definitely since 2015. It provides the European Union its only definitely non-democracy, which is categorized as an electoral autocracy by VDEM, Freedom House, and also, among others, the European Parliament as well. And the fastest autocratizing country in the world, which is still a defective democracy, but demonstrated the fastest decline, which is Poland. And we see in a small scale all of the dynamics, what you mentioned. There are clear autocratizing tendencies, democratic champions, and countries which oscillate in the gray zone, either due to government changes or because they are in a permanent state of instability. Bulgaria is a very good example for the status of permanent instability now since 2021. And potentially Slovakia can be the example where government changes in 4-year terms oscillate the country between illiberal and liberal democratic governments. And against that background, for the democratic champions in the region, like the Baltic states, like Czechia since last year, elevating their perception as real democratic players and practically drawing a line between themselves and the autocrats in the region is an existential PR question. And for them, practically the Summit for Democracy is a real political game, and they have potentially the highest stake aside of the United States among all of the participants in this project. And the third reason is that I think that the conclusions what we drew on this group of countries can be extrapolated at the level of the European Union. So the lessons learned from Central and Eastern Europe are lessons learned valid for the role of the European Union and its participation in the Summit for Democracy process as well. And after this very long introduction, practically my main point would be that both at the level of the Central and Eastern European countries, but in a broader sense also for members of the European Union, they are the most active participants of the Summit for Democracy at a formal institutional level. Just imagine that aside of North America, Canada and the United States, the most overrepresented part of the world when it comes to leadership position in different cohorts is Central and Eastern Europe. More than half of the cohorts has a Central and Eastern European country leading or co-leading it. Meanwhile, among the classical Western European democracies, we have practically only Sweden, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom as cohort leads, since Denmark, we discussed it earlier, practically abandoned its leadership position in digital democracy and is not leading anymore the cohort on digital democracy in the Summit for Democracy process. So we have this very strong and intense level of formal participation, but if we take a look on the output level, then we see no impact. We see no visibility, and we don't see that this participation and this engagement would change the perception of European participation in the overall process, because I think this overall perception is that Europe is lukewarm, and the large European countries are not actively participating, at least not actively participating according to their diplomatic and foreign policy weight in the process. Germany and France are largely absent at the leadership level. Practically the largest European country with an active role in the process is Spain. So the three largest countries are absent from the process. How can we explain this imbalance of formal participation and lack of output, lack of impact? And I think we have at least two good explanations for that. First, what is the reason for Central and Eastern European countries to engage actively in the process? Back in 2021, for example, Lithuania and Slovakia were the staunchest supporters when this initiative was started. There was an official side event in Lithuania on opposing autocracy. Slovakia at that time played a crucial role in launching the cohort on media pluralism for a very simple reason. They wanted to please the United States and keep the United States close to themselves and practically raise their own value, their own weight in Washington as close and credible and trustful allies. They just wanted to make transatlantic relationship closer through this, I would say, very pragmatic and also very low-cost soft power diplomacy investment. In 2022, there is apparently, or at least at the surface, no need for such an investment. And the reason is that transatlantic relationship has never been closer, better coordinated, obviously, due to Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine. And against that background, we also see that The diplomatic resources of Central and Eastern European countries are overburdened. They cannot necessarily invest in the coordination. They cannot necessarily invest in generating inputs. And this is one explanation, obviously. And the second one, they don't need it because they are practically now in the limelight. They are, in a large extent, determining the dynamics of European-US transatlantic relationship. My title is The Missed Opportunities. If ultimately we can conclude at that level that there is no need for such investment in transatlantic relations because it's anyhow in a historical hate, then what are the missed opportunities? And I would like to argue very briefly, and I round up, that there are at least 3 missed opportunities, at least now. Some of these missed opportunities, I think, can be rectified potentially by the next Summit for Democracy, which will be definitely a make or break moment and a watershed moment, and will determine whether this process can continue or not. I think one missed opportunity is that practically Europe is just very content with the quality of the transatlantic relations on the surface. And against that background, it's miss the opportunities to invest in the future of this relationship. Obviously, the US is not necessarily a trustful or credible partner, to put it in that straightforward way. We know that in 2024, practically, there can be a U-turn in the whole US approach to democracy. And the Summit of Democracy can practically vanish and become part of the history. That will happen if the GOP wins the next elections. But I think this is not a credible argument for European partners not to invest in the other 50% chance that Democrats will remain in power. And when this war will end, there will be a significant decrease in the cordiality and intensity of transatlantic cooperation. That's obvious. Pleasing the US with cooperation in such low-key soft policy areas like the Summit for Democracy, I think would be a very easy way to get the United States in some way logged in Europe. Because it's not a sustainable model that European countries are only investing in transatlantic cooperation when the maintaining of the European security order is at stake. So, and obviously Europe needs the United States more than vice versa. So against that background, I think it's a missed opportunity into investing in future, into investing in the real sustainable form of this Summit for Democracy process. I think the second missed opportunity is investing in the facelifting of Europe's democratic credentials. Obviously, the United States has very serious democracy problems. And the current US administration is admitting that. We don't see European officials speaking straightforwardly to a global audience about the internal democratic challenges and problems of the European Union. Although we know that they exist, we know that there are EU member states, at least one, which was not invited to the Summit for Democracy. And that's also the reason why the European Union couldn't have a joint mandate by the Summit for Democracy. That humility, which is demonstrated or was demonstrated by the United States over the past 2 Summit for Democracies, is lacking at the European end. Meanwhile, the European Union is proudly presenting itself as a community which is built on the values of democracy, rule of law, and human rights. And we don't see all of this engagement, all of the ownership to present Europe as a key global player when it comes to democracy. And the third one, and potentially that is the least tangible part, I think the Summit for Democracy, because it was shaped as a global process and reaching far beyond Western democracies, offered a very good opportunity and again a very low-key soft power diplomacy investments in the relationship between European countries, Central and Eastern European countries and European countries, and democracies in East Asia. With Japan, with South Korea, with other countries. And against the background of not the decoupling, but the diversification of European relationship to China, to other key economic powers in the East Asian space, this could have been a low-hanging fruit to establish connection, to build trust, to create a frequent engagement with East Asian democracies. And obviously the next summit hosted by South Korea would offer the perfect opportunity for that. But if Europe is not ready to fill the vacuum which will be left by the United States, which is making a step back from this whole process, and without significantly investing in all of this relationship with non-European democracies, with creating an image of ownership, European ownership behind the Summit for Democracy, and reflecting on their own shortcomings when it comes to democracy, I think this process will fail. And potentially there won't even be a next summit in Seoul, or that will be the last summit. And just concluding with a reference to your last point, that obviously the Summit for Democracy failed to grow up to the original expectations. But I'm a Central and Eastern European, and allegedly those guys are one of the most pessimistic from the global population. But I think we should have an approach to to see the glass that it's half full. Would the world be a better place without the Summit for Democracy process? Has it hurt the global politics that over the past 2 or 3 years there was a continuous engagement and self-reflection on democracy on a global scale? I think if we don't do anything else, just keep the issue on the global agenda, that's already a positive sum game. And that's just the minimum what we can achieve with that if we keep that process alive. So against that background, I think overall, the Summit for Democracy was not what we expected to be, but it definitely delivered positive outcomes for global politics. And thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And Richard, the floor or stage is yours. I think I will join you up here because I feel like I'm away.
Okay, so I think to finish off this first round of introductions, maybe I just zoom out and put the summit in a slightly broader context. I think global democracy stands at a fairly crucial moment. The summit is part of that, but it's not everything. It's only one component. I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine has opened up some quite profound and difficult debates about democracy around the world, how democracy is performing within individual countries, but also more broadly the role of democracy in international relations, its geopolitical weight. I think we can see this at 3 different levels or 3 components. The first is the summit itself. The second is the general international commitment to supporting and upholding democratic norms. Most international support for democracy is still not going through the summit. It still has nothing to do with the summit itself, and it's important to bear that in mind. And third, I would say, is the question of the role of democracy in the war in Ukraine itself. My cross-cutting conclusion would be more or less the same as Rasmus's and Daniel, that the summit and these other components have given added weight and presence to debates about international democracy, but so far they haven't really been a fundamental game changer. We haven't seen a qualitative shift in the prominence or the importance of democracy issues in international relations. Running through each of the components very briefly, on the Summit for Democracy itself, my assessment is largely the same, and in fact Rasmus gave most of the points that I was going to give. It's very easy to be entirely dismissive of the summit. I'm sure people here have read many press articles which suggest that nothing really has been achieved, that the summit process has fallen dramatically short of what was set as its original expectations and aims. My assessment is also slightly more balanced than that. I think it has developed some concrete substance. It's put global coordination on the agenda. I think much more was achieved in this recent second summit than most people expected to be the case. You all know the basic dynamic behind the difficulties in the summit was that non-Western democracies have not supported and recoiled from Western democracy's framing of the Ukraine conflict as being the kind of pivotal issue for the future of global democracy. This isn't a perspective that is shared around the world, and there was some tension within the Summit for Democracy over this issue. As a result, I think the summit itself has become slightly less focused on big geopolitical issues and much more on the specific themes that Rasmus outlined in terms of the cohorts. One can argue there's good and bad in this focusing down on the narrower thematic issues. It's meant the summit process has perhaps develop more real concrete substance than critics expected it to have done. But it is also the case that ultimately the summit as it stands at the moment has focused on these big themes rather than the issues related to the war in Ukraine, which is the theme here of our summit. So good and bad there, but I would also reject the conclusion that the summit has not achieved anything. It could be the start of a very long process of generating real substance behind democratic coordination. It's functioning at a rather low level. It didn't elicit a great deal of media attention. It's not going to be a big game changer in terms of high geopolitics. I think now we stand at a fairly crucial moment. You all know that one of the big complaints in the process was that the agenda was set in a fairly unilateral manner by the United States. As Daniel was saying, most of the participation has come either from North American states or from European states. I also share his assessment that although in formal terms European governments have signed up to the process, they haven't actually invested, I would say, any great degree of priority in the process so far. The degree of global buy-in from other democracies around the world has been there. Other countries have bought into the process. They've turned up. They've participated in cohorts. They've made commitments to improve their own internal democratic processes and indeed to support democracy in a more proactive way internationally as well. But the complaint has been that most of the agenda has been set by the US. Most of the lead roles in running the cohorts, the thematic cohorts, has come from European states. Now we have Korea set up to run the third summit. Potentially, I think the way is open for non-Western democracies to play more of a agenda-setting role, more of a significant proactive role in the process. This is a fairly crucial moment. We have to see if this does transpire, if other democracies do step up and play more of a leading and meaningful role in the process, and indeed where the process goes without the US playing such a lead role. So I think in all that sense, the process has been valuable. It opens the door to other democracies around the world coming in, at least talking about how they would like to frame the agenda of global democracy support. Much has been said on the negative side about divisions between democracies around the world over the war in Ukraine. It's worth recalling that significant differences have emerged between autocracies as well. What we do not have is a situation where democratic nations are hopelessly divided on the one hand, and all autocracies around the world are perfectly coordinated and cooperating effectively on an autocracy promotion agenda. What we see is a world that is not neatly defined in terms of democracies and autocracies. I think this is a cross-cutting theme that the three of us will keep coming back to us. But the divisions are there amongst autocracies as they are amongst democracies as well. So I share the basic assessment that these are all useful positive steps. They're not a big game changer, but the concrete issue or question is there whether in concrete terms the next phase of the Summit for Democracy process can begin to add some concrete resources, some concrete substances, can actually begin to make a tangible difference to push back against some of the trends in autocratization that Rasmus explained to us in the beginning. So far, the summit has set itself up to fashion dialogue that talks about the generic importance of democracy, certain themes within democracy, the role of technology, the role of women, the role of youth, so on and so forth, but it is very detached from the country level challenges that are actually menacing and putting democracy at risk in concrete places around the world. That's my assessment of the Summit for Democracy. The second question is that in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Western governments made big commitments to reinforce their support for democracy around the world. You all know the narrative, the abiding narrative has been that the war in Ukraine is not just about Ukraine, it's a war for democratic values, and as such, it requires Western governments radically to step up their support for democracy. That hasn't really happened. The summit is one very modest part of the equation. Most of the commitments to support democracy from European governments, from the US and others, are still taking place completely outside and separate from the summit. So this has not had an overarching impact in terms of restructuring the commitment to global democracy. The United States has added quite a bit of new money, as Rasmus was telling us, through the presidential initiative and indeed other initiatives. European states have not really done so far. Denmark is still a leading player in democracy support around the world, but European governments, despite all the rhetoric about the Ukraine war being won for democratic values, has not radically increased the commitment in either financial or diplomatic terms to upholding democratic norms around the world. There have been some new initiatives, some new resources invested, but the increase so far has been relatively modest, and I would say is not really at the same level as the rhetorical support for the defense of democracy in Ukraine. Interestingly, the whole way in which democracy is being reframed, is being rethought, is of significance, because the whole agenda of supporting democracy today, because of the war in Ukraine, is very much about European governments supporting democracy within Europe itself, seeing this as much more of a security imperative in a much more kind of comprehensive and holistic way. The EU is actually at the moment working up something called a defense of democracy package. This is in large measure a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and it's about trying to defend European democracy from external threats against open politics in Europe itself. I think one impact of the war, of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is that this kind of focus, this securitized impact in terms of defending European democracy itself, will be much more prominent part of the democracy agenda in the future, and probably more of a prominent part than the EU's efforts to support democracy externally. And then I'll say final point to put on the table is the role of democracy in the Ukraine conflict itself. European governments, the US and others, have invested a lot of money in military support for Ukraine in trying to fight the war. So far, the role of democracy in this has not been of paramount importance. So the defense of Ukraine's sovereignty is tied up with the defense of its democracy. Ukraine's democratic identity is at the forefront of the kind of the motivations for Ukrainian civil society mobilizing in the war. But the two agendas, the agenda of defending Ukraine's sovereignty and the agenda of defending democracy in Ukraine, are not synonymous. They are not one and the same thing. And at the moment, in the last year, the focus has been on defending Ukrainian sovereignty. The focus on democracy initiatives in Ukraine has been very much less prominent. We all know that European governments, the US, journalists, analysts have expressed great admiration for Ukrainian civil society and the role it has played in showing robust resilience against the Russian invasion. But the amount of money Ukrainian civil society is actually getting from European governments, from the US at the moment, isn't that great. It doesn't really match up with this rhetorical admiration that we've all been paying to Ukrainian civil society over the last year. I think gradually, as the war moves into its next phase, there will be more of a focus on defending and improving the quality of democracy in Ukraine, but that will entail some very difficult trade-offs in terms of the balance between democracy-related objectives on the one hand and security-related objectives on the other hand. In the terms of the EU's contribution to Ukraine, a lot of this will hinge around the pre-accession process and just how stringent the EU's democracy-related conditions are on Ukraine in terms of moving that accession process forward. So I think I'll leave it there, but I would say basically then it's important to understand that the big debates about global democracy are not just about the summit itself. The relationship between the summit and the war in Ukraine are quite complex. There are various components there that are restructuring the global politics of democracy. Over the last year, since the war started, we've seen the big geopolitics of democracy begin to shift, but we haven't, in my mind, seen them radically alter, at least as yet.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Richard, and Rasmus and Daniel as well. Just moving on. There's so much ground to cover. We want to make sure that we have plenty of time for Q&A as well. I just want to start with, let's see if, whoops, there it goes. We are going back through the slideshow of, there we are. So you mentioned this, the decline in, sort of democratic decline that's been going on over the years. And if you look at the map here from global freedom status of countries being not free, partly free, and free, there's been a whole debate around which countries were then invited and which were not invited. And I wanted to ask you about because it feels like you're underlining the positive side here, that it might not all be a bad outcome. However, there has been quite a lot of framing, it feels like, around this democracy versus autocracy. So I was wondering about this framing of the summit and it's sort of what purposes it has and what are its side effects. I mean, could it be that this project is so much a sort of a value-based project aimed at strengthening democracy, geopolitical project, the West against China? Is it that does not over rule the more sort of positive, balanced things there are as well? I wonder if you want to say, Daniel.
I think no one can give an objective and a neutral answer to this question. So mine will be also a very normative one. For me, this is an inward-looking project of democracies, where at least if we really take a look on the process itself, it's mostly about developing different aspects of existing democracies, not even liberal democracies. So against that background, I think we can fairly state that it's an inclusive process. It takes a look on the civil society component, on the media component, on the technological component, gender inclusion, so different components of democracy. And these 117 participants try to make commitments in these different aspects. And I think from a perspective of a democratic community, it's an absolutely legitimate attempt to have occasions of such self-reflection. Obviously, there is also an external interference or combating external interference component. Certain emphasis is laid on that component by the United States, but not exclusively. There is the Frontline Democracies initiative there, which was spearheaded by Lithuania. And I think we also have to acknowledge and recognize that there are certain democracies in the club, even in Europe, who feel existentially threatened by authoritarian interference. Obviously, we can criticize the logic behind the invitations, because very often it's not necessarily and exclusively based on democracy measuring. No one in politics is using really Freedom House or VDEM to differentiate between countries. A lot of strategic decisions were also made in that regard. Even, for example, just to invite Poland and not to invite Hungary, to mention two countries what I know a bit better. But obviously, you cannot practically just take out strategy from strategical decisions from high-level diplomatic events. And very lastly, on the dichotomy of autocracy and democracy, I think this is the right one. Obviously, it can be divisive at the global stage, but at least it's not a blurred language of illiberalism, democratic backsliding, which is happening, but no one would like to identify the actors behind it. If we take a look on all of the illiberal developments throughout the world, sooner or later they result in autocratization, which starts with putting leverage on civil society, media pluralism. It ends up impacting electoral integrity as well. We saw that in the case of Turkey, we saw that in the case of Hungary, we saw that in the case of Poland, we saw that in the case of the United States. Mm-hmm. It's obvious, it's autocratization. And I think the start to address the challenges to democracy is that we are able to identify the challenges in a proper way. That's autocracy.
Mm-hmm. Richard?
My reading of the situation is that when the Biden administration initially conceived of the summit, they did see it as quite a high-level security initiative, which was about dividing the world between democracies and autocracies, trying to get democracies working together at quite a high strategic level to push back against the influence of autocracies. And that didn't really work. Most democracies around the world pushed back against this idea. Interestingly, over the last 2 or 3 decades, this idea of alliances of democracies or concerts of democracies has reappeared frequently, and it never really works because international relations, we all know, are so complicated that divisions, interests are never going to divide between democracies and autocracies in such a neat way. That's fairly obvious. It's become fairly obvious. And I think now the US and others have walked back from this idea that the division between democracies and autocracies is going to become the major organizing principle of international relations. I think it's easy to go to the other extreme and say the big geopolitical challenges today, whether they be China, what's going on in Ukraine, Russia, energy, so on and so forth, are only about geopolitics and interests and realpolitik, and that the whole narrative about democracy and defending values is disingenuous. It seems to me that the power of support for democratic values has become more real and more tangible, and it's become more of a backbone of international relations. That does not mean it's going to override all the other divisions that exist, all the other layers of interests and strategic alliances that exist, but it seems to me it will be one component. I think that means that the summit process itself probably is not going to function as a really big high-level geopolitical initiative, but focus more on these cohorts. But I do think we can't take out these more strategic and foreign policy dimensions of democracy and this very complicated relationship between democracies and autocracies. If the process ends up only functioning at this very kind of narrow thematic level, then I think that overarching geopolitical dimension will get lost from view. We cannot lose it from view because it's that big geopolitical dimension that I think structures all these other thematic areas that the summit process has begun to focus on.
Just briefly, I mean, there's been a lot of talk about this dichotomy from Biden himself in speeches whenever he stands in Poland and addresses the role of, the larger framing around, say, the war in Ukraine. Then he likes to draw in the whole democracy, autocracy, and the inflection point in history and how we're But I think that's one thing, that's rhetoric, right? And another thing is the way that summit has been set up, where they decided for the first summit to opt for a large tent. I mean, they could have had a very brief list of invitees from liberal democracies, or they could do what they did, which is taking a much broader perspective, bringing in countries that are not free, or at least only partly free. And you can always discuss the individual countries, as people have done relentlessly in the criticism. But it does have the benefit of making this a more global initiative. If you were to be strictly pure on the ideological thing and only include countries with a certain score, not only would you be limited rather to sort of a small sort of Western segment with a few Asian countries in, you would also start looking at the US and question whether they could make the cut themselves. So that would also be a problem. So very smart enough, they've opted for the sort of broad perspective there. I think, and then of course by focusing now increasingly on these thematic cohorts, it becomes somewhat more of a technocratic process, you could say, where you're sort of dealing with concrete things. How can we make the internet work better, blah, 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 instead of focusing on Taiwan and Ukraine, sort of putting geopolitical hotspots front and center. And so that has sort of de-emphasized the whole democracy, autocracy framing around the summit itself and allowed them to focus on more practical issues in making democracy at home work better. And I think that's a positive development.
Right. I came across this article by in Foreign Affairs by Samantha Power, who many of you will know. She's the head of USAID, so the International Development Agency in the US, former US ambassador to the UN. She wrote an article which was, and she was obviously a key speaker as well, and I think in the summit. But I just came across this quote where she says, "Among the biggest errors many democracies have made since the Cold War is to view individual dignity primarily through the prism of political freedom without being sufficiently attentive to the indignity of corruption, inequality, and a lack of economic opportunity." And that made me think about, what do we actually talk about when we talk about democracy, and has there sort of been a development, or is there a sort of understanding in the US idea and what kind of democracy ideal we are trying to present here, also in terms of what kind of countries we may be able to include, because there is this divide, right, classically between political freedom, which when we talk about Freedom House and these indicators that we've been talking about, very much around these civil individual rights, and then we have economic opportunity on the other hand, right, socio-economic rights. I just wondered if you see any kind of development there. It's actually this naive question, like, what do we actually talk about when we talk about democracy here?
I would actually disagree with this contention, because it implies that the problem is that democracy support organizations have given too much priority to political rights and not enough attention to economic rights or economic development. And in fact, it seems to me that it's exactly the other way around, that even leading players in development like Denmark and other donors have for many, many decades given far more money to economic projects, tried to generate economic development than they have to political rights. So it seems to me it's exactly the other way round from what she is suggesting. We actually recently did crunch the numbers on where aid is going in terms of political regime types, with the OECD has good data on this. And about 80% of development aid is going to authoritarian regimes, non-democratic regimes. And most of that aid is going to governments directly for economic development projects. It's not going to civil society for political rights issues. So, and the trouble there is that the whole notion that international organizations can support economic development, and then economic development leads smoothly to political liberalization hasn't proven to be the case with many countries around the world. In fact, many countries, as they develop economically, become more restricted politically, more authoritarian. So I think that puts into question this assumption that the primary focus should be on supporting economic development and less focus should be given to political issues. That it seems to me that the challenge really is to get both of those issues going in tandem with each other, rather than suggesting one should be given more weight relative to the other. So I think I would probably question this assumption.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I fully agree with Richard's, and in that regard, I just would like to underline that would be a rather large need for decoupling democracy assistance from development aid. But in that regard, I think this Samantha Power statement is not necessarily reflecting the democracy understanding of USAID, but it reflects on a necessary diplomatic trade-off. And it is, if you would like to buy in the global south into a global democracy movement, then you have to embrace the sustainable development goals, which are, we know, rather about good governance, but definitely not about democracy. So it's just a gesture to make the whole process inclusive. The part of the statement, what I think is mirroring a sort of change in the democracy understanding, which relates to anti-corruption. Because we have seen over the past 2 or 3 years this rise of anti-corruption, anti-corrosive capital approach in the United States, because US stakeholders understood that corruption in democracies is practically the open door for authoritarian influence, and this is what they would like to combat with the approach. And this also explains why the US is putting one of the largest emphasis on the anti-malign finance, anti-corruption cohorts in the whole process. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, and just to mention there, just immediately before this first summit, the United States put out its first strategy on combating corruption. And it was, of course, one of the original pillars for the first summit as well. So corruption is probably one of the underlying themes here in terms of this article with Samantha Power as well. Some recognition that corruption internally and also economic inequality internally in democracies is a threat to the legitimacy of democracy, and that there needs to be some serious efforts undertaken to address inequality, including through corruption. Of course, the anti-corruption measures that has been launched in connection to the summit has also very much dealt with kleptocracies, and so sort of fighting basically corruption from members of authoritarian regimes. So again, that also sort of ties together both the sort of pushing back against authoritarianism while at the same time dealing with corruption and economic inequality. I think it's in the context of that maybe that there is an increased focus on the economic aspects also of democracies.
Okay, I think we should open the floor for questions. I think we'll maybe take 2 at the time. And yes, in the interest of time, please be as specific and concrete as possible. So we have, 2 here. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for very insightful presentations. My name is Oksana. I represent Ukrainian University. I'm PhD fellow of Skorodan University and also a research assistant at Copenhagen University. My question is about the definition of democracy itself. Will the summit, maybe in the nearest or far future, help most of the countries understand what democracy is? Because if we think about countries like Iran, for example, I'm working on Iran, which is called Mardum Salari Dini, which means that like the power of nation ruled by religion or something like that. So in most of the countries which are not democratic, people think, or people are made to think that they live in democracy. So this is question number 1. Will it help like to everybody to get to the more generalized definition of democracy? And also like the list of countries which were not invited, will it somehow radicalize where their like anti-democratic position. So 2 questions like that. Thank you.
Those one be okay. We'll do and then we'll go back.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. That's okay. Please.
Hi, I'm Dino Krause. I work as a postdoc here at DIIS. I have a question to Daniel Hegedüsch. You spoke about the fact that Germany and France were not very involved in the summit, and I would be curious if you could expand a bit more on, and also maybe the other speakers, why that was the case, why they've been rather hesitant in that regard. And thank you all for great presentations.
Should we start with those 2? So I don't know.
I can go first on the first question, or at least one of them. Certainly, it's there's a paradox in the sort of global democratic recession, 17 consecutive years, the rise of authoritarianism, and then on the other hand, you see virtually every country on earth defining itself as some form of democracy and drawing its legitimacy from the support of its people. And there was a relatively recent study, I believe, by Harvard, where they asked people, do you believe we live in a democracy? And there China scored the highest. So, I mean, in that sense, what do we mean by democracy, right? That is always present in these debates. And I don't think I'm going to provide any sort of definition or authoritative answer here, just to say that it is an interesting paradox that at the one hand we have the sort of so-called crisis of democracy, and then on the other hand we have this democracy being the only game in town, so to speak. Even the non-democracies kind of want to be democracies. And we saw also China launched their own democracy summit in response to the Summits for Democracy, trying to claim sort of Chinese democracy and sort of so there is, and of course Orban in Hungary is a Christian democracy, and there are these sort of, there's a struggle going on as well about who gets to define what democracy is, and some sort of movement there, which I guess you could argue that the crisis of democracy that we talk about so much is really the crisis of liberal democracy, and maybe even more so the crisis of liberalism itself. And there are those who seek to repurpose democracy for their own agendas with a more nationalist or Christian or communist Chinese perspective.
Maybe on the second part of the question for the non-invited countries, now thinking about you, Daniel, for instance, around the a country like Hungary, for instance, but it could be other countries as well. Will it radicalize the?
No, I think most of these governments consider this to be a non-issue. So of course they are partially offended, but it's definitely not elevated in the domestic narrative or propaganda. Just one thought on the democracy issue. I think any attempt to define democracy would be only exclusive, and would significantly undermine the original goal of the whole Summit for Democracy process. As Rasmus mentioned, practically the popular support to democracy as an ideal form, as a survey question, is worthless. If we take a look, for example, the support to the existing form of democracy, just in the European Union, that's a standard Eurobarometer question, you will see surprisingly low figures in very established democracies like France. I think it's definitely below 50%, so it oscillates just slightly around 40. It's even lower in countries like Slovakia, it's below 40%. And against that background, I think the true variable that shows the quality of the democracy and also the social embeddedness of democracy is, on the one hand, really the performance of a country, for example, on the VDEM, Liberal Democracy Index, and aside of that, a high level of social satisfaction with the existing form of democracy. And practically there are just a couple of countries which achieve that level: the Scandinavian countries, the Netherlands, and practically Canada. So these are the countries which have a high level of liberal democracy, and it's embedded in the society. It's even a much more narrower club than existing Western democracies. And And concerning the question of why the large EU member states were not supporting, I don't have any answer. On the part of GMF, for example, in the run-up to the first Summit for Democracy, we tried to organize a European platform for ministries of foreign affairs to develop a genuine European agenda to the summit. Getting France, Germany, and the European External Action Service to these events was extremely difficult because they see that as pointless, divisive, and a very blurred American project which is not necessarily benefiting their political interest. I think that was a very short-sighted approach, but not so surprising against the background that especially before the last German election, and we know the French positions in that regard, there is some lukewarm approach to US initiatives and to follow them without criticism. So it's not so surprising.
I agree with that, and it picked up the same kind of feeling from some of the big Western European governments in particular, and their hesitancy over the process. But I think because of that now, with Korea taking over, I think that will push European governments actually a little bit to clarify what they want out of the initiative, because they won't be able to say anymore this is just a US-led initiative that could be counterproductive if it begins to get a little bit more of a global buy-in. I think that ought to galvanize a bit more European interest in the initiative, and it'd be interesting to see if that comes forward. I agree on the definitions point as well. I think the summit process has steered clear from any really concise definition of democracy. We all know that that's very contentious around the world, except very indirectly what it's done is to try and open up some ability of people around the world to explore other kinds of more direct and deliberative forms of democracy. There was a big debate on this within that summit process, and eventually it was agreed to add a cohort on deliberative democracy. And it could be that is one of the areas that thrives in the future and may enable different countries around the world with different institutional understandings and definitions of the democracy to get away from what is perceived to be the kind of Western template and explore more direct ways of getting ordinary citizens participating in democratic politics. So very obliquely and indirectly, the summit process has just gently opened the door, I would say, to exploring those kind of questions. And I think on the issue of invitations, this will be a really difficult question to manage in the future, because now with Korea taking over the third summit and then perhaps other countries having more of a say, the question will be whether they stick to the US's decision about who to invite and who not to invite. Most countries around the world criticize these decisions. The fact that, as the map showed, the US invited many countries that were less democratic than many of the countries it did not invite. So will Korea reopen the issue of invitations? Will countries like South Africa, Pakistan that decided not to participate reevaluate their decisions and perhaps buy into the process if it's not the US leading it? So I think this whole issue of who to invite, who's involved, who's not involved, will become a bigger issue in the future.
Interesting. There's a question here and behind as well. I think, and then, yeah.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, hi, this is Ibad. I'm from Pakistan, currently studying at Aarhus University and a freelance journalist. Especially, I just wanted to ask, right, the exclusion of Turkey in the conference, right? Given the fact, in the context to the fact that Turkey's vote is very much pertinent for Sweden's inclusion in NATO. So not inviting the Turkey in the summit, what was the strategic gains that were intended, and how were they achieved, or was it something that that was aimed for that didn't meet the eye? Thank you.
Yep. Hi, thanks a lot. My name is Jacob. I do Turkey here at DIIS. Really interesting stuff. Of course, this is infinitely complicated, right? Poland is, of course, necessary vis-a-vis Ukraine, and India and Modi is necessary vis-a-vis China. So, going down a more realist approach to things, Biden going to a fist bump MBS last summer because there was an oil issue, et cetera, right? It's really, really difficult, this game. I like to pick up on one thing that you mentioned, Rasmus, is this idea of democracy delivering. Because I think that what really matters, right? It's not democratic at like democracy conferences. It's delivering, right? Post Cold War, it delivered, right? Now we're delivering. We weren't delivering for a long time. We had financial crisis. We had Trump. We had Brexit. We had Afghanistan. We had a lot of things where we weren't delivering. We had indecision, right? Now we're delivering. So democracy is attractive now because of two things. Because we can fight, right? We're really good with weapons. We're really good with intelligence. We can see that in Ukraine. You see how bad corruption was for the Russian army. Corruption is not just bad because it's bad for democracy. It also just doesn't deliver. I do Turkey, right? Erdogan has issues now because he wasn't delivering on building houses that were earthquake-proof. Because of what? Corruption. They weren't delivering, right? Also economically, we are delivering now, vis-a-vis some of the other countries. China was attractive for a long time, but they're not so attractive anymore because where is China going, economically? Demographics, investment model, all these things, question mark. So right now we're delivering on hard power and on economy. On the other hand, corruption has real-time issues with delivering on fighting and economy as well. So it's not about, Turkey, just one last question, or one last point. Turkey became a member of NATO. Why? Because Stalin threatened to take the Straits in 1950. Before that, they were neutral, right? They had a first democratic election in 1950, and they became NATO member in 1952, right? Hard power, right? So it's not about democracy conferences. It's about delivering. And right now we're delivering. We might not in a couple of years if Trump comes back or, if it's DeSantis or whoever it is, right? So it's because we're delivering. It's not because, all this nice talk. It's a bit of a cynical question. Thank you.
And now the mic is here. I thought there was a hand here as well, right? Yes. So let's take a,
Thank you. I'm Vibe Termansen. I'm a writer and historian about East and Central Europe. I would be very pleased for a comment from you, Mr. Rasmus Sinding Søndergaard, and you, Daniel Hegedus, on the relationship between the US, the host of the summit, and Hungary, the not invited. Because we saw some new signs now. The new ambassador in Budapest, the new American ambassador, brought his family, his husband and his children, and I'm sure he's a very skilled diplomat. But I'm also sure they could have found someone else who is not homosexual and who didn't work with human rights before coming there. So, and right now, the US Embassy in Budapest is financing a campaign in Hungary about Hungary 1956, so reminding the Hungarians about their fight against the Russians in 1956. Is this sign that the US finally had it with Hungary? And I'm not talking about democracy, I'm talking about Russia and NATO. Thank you.
All right, so should we start with Turkey? The exclusion of Turkey and why that was? I don't know who you would, Richard?
I don't have too much inside information. My understanding is it was a difficult decision because it was recognized that there could be a strategic cost of excluding Turkey, but all the indices show that Turkey is one of the most fast and deepest autocratizing countries anywhere in the world over the last decade, and it really would have made a mockery of the whole democracy criterion of the event if Turkey were to be invited. I think, as Daniel said, I doubt that it was any particular loss to Erdogan himself being excluded from a democracy coordinating initiative, but I think it was one of those issues where the trend towards authoritarianism in Turkey has just gone so far it couldn't really be justified. But then, of course, there are other countries invited whose inclusion it would be difficult to justify as well. every so often these ideas of clubs of democracy come up, and this is always one of the tricky issues. The community of democracies that was set up 20 years ago floundered on this issue because it ended up including a large number of states that were not well-functioning democracies, became more authoritarian, and that just sucked out the dynamism and the oxygen from the community of democracies, and that could become something that happens to the summit process as well. And then one other point on the issue about democracies stepping up to deliver. I think that this is true, and the fact that European democracies have responded in a reasonably robust way with hard power in the case of the conflict in Ukraine is relevant and will impact on democracy. The response from other democracies around the world is that democracy is still not delivering, and the Summit for Democracy should not overly focus on the fact that European democracies have been very resilient in trying to defend Ukraine, that in many developing countries, democracy still is not delivering, and there the big issues have to do with economics and other issues rather than the use of hard power in Ukraine. So it's a difficult balancing act. The narrative to do with Ukraine is important from a European perspective, but for other democracies around the world, there are still far more important factors quite separate from Ukraine that determine whether democracy is delivering or not.
Yeah. Just briefly on Turkey. In the summer of 2021, I was interviewing think tankers and State Department officials in the US, and there were 3 countries that was interesting on the guest list question, and that was Poland, Hungary, and Turkey. And I think from already then I gathered that politically in the US, excluding Turkey was the easiest one of those, because there was not going to be a Republican opposition claiming, why did you not include Turkey? And that was like a sort of politically in the US, that was not so hard to sell. And obviously Poland was too important from a strategic perspective, but that goes for the whole guest list and all the countries, right? In the State Department, you have people who are working with the White House on this initiative, who are interested in getting the right countries from a democracy perspective. And then you have those who have regional assignments, who are interested in US diplomacy in the region. So they don't want to push away potential allies by not including them, or by including one country and not another. So there's also that balancing act within the administration, where there are those in the State Department who prioritize US diplomatic relations with these countries and have to balance that concern with those who are then tasked with trying to come up with the best guest list that will get the least criticism. So there are balancing concerns within the administration and different views, of course, on who should be invited. Yeah.
Right. And then there was the question around the relationship between the US and Hungary specifically. I don't know. I think it was.
I think Daniel is way better positioned to answer that than me.
We'll leave it to Daniel.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Just one sentence to Turkey. If I'm not wrong, then in 2021 this decision coincided with the S-400 F-35 crisis. So it also from strategic. Okay, the mood was there. So it was practically the deepest point of Turkish-US relationship. And, if you once excluded a country, you need to see significant development to be invited for the second time. And it was an obvious decision not to invite these 2 countries because there was no development since 2021. In the case of Poland, a further argument was to drive a wedge between the autocratizing twins of the European Union, to invite Poland and not to invite Hungary, and to distance these 2 countries from each other. And I think that was a very clever and the right approach from the United States. Concerning Hungary, there are 2 models of autocratization within the Western world. One model is pursued by Poland and started to be pursued by Italy, and that's the old Cold War model, trading non-interference into domestic affairs in exchange for geopolitical loyalty. And Poland is a master of that strategy. Another strategy is pursuing a multivectoral foreign policy and putting leverage on your Western partners, the United States and the European Union. Hungary and Turkey stand for this multivectoral foreign policy model. And obviously, Wiebe, you are absolutely right. Now the patience of the United States grow very thin with Hungary, not necessarily due to the lack of democratic performance, but practically the disturbing factor, the country presence in the Western alliance system. And obviously there is a growing US activism. USAID relaunched last autumn their democracy assistance in the Central European region. Poland, Hungary, and Bulgaria are the focus countries. And I cannot necessarily confirm that, but there are increasingly intense rumors about coming US sanctions against Hungarian officials at different levels, both from USG, the White House, in the form of potential Magnitsky sanctions, and also legislative initiative in the Congress, which demonstrates that really the patience of the United States with Hungary is practically gone.
All right, I think we have time for, I think it was 2 questions here, and okay, there was one there as well.
Yes, hello. I'm Jacob Hansen. I'm writing. I'm a writer from local magazines, and I have a question for the panel. Yes, we have this shadowing in global politics media. Always real, always important. We had the pandemic, we had Syria, we had Ukraine conflict. However, just recently we had a pop-up on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the US being in an election year, apparently not that valid an alliance on democratic politics. What's the panel's take on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Thank you.
I don't know if we'll see what take there might be and see if it's related to the summit for democracy, which is still the topic. There was a question here from this gentleman over here in front.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Raisam. I'm an exile Cambodian politician here in Denmark. I just want to share my perspective regarding to the decline of democracy, what I experienced for the 20 years. What I see is the mistake of strategic thinking of the Democratic Alliance. That I agree with the speaker. They say that they think about economic interests, and they don't think about human rights and democracy before. Like they have friendship with the country that is ruled by dictatorship, and they ignore about the voice of like those who fight for freedom and democracy, and they are lack support. Especially they have no like economic support like the regime of dictatorship that they promote, that they have economic and they have everything. And when the Democratic Alliance that they have relationship with dictatorship, and then seem to be like motivate them to press against the democracy. So this is one thing that is the like mistake of strategic thinking. For example, like recently the visit of like Macron till China. We know that Russia is violate international law. We know that China is violate human rights and support, for example, dictatorship in Cambodia. This longest dictatorship, 40 years that press and repress violate human rights. That in the high record of the international community. But still, why this have a relation? What is the cause of relation when they know that China and Russia, they have, again with the Democratic Alliance, they always ignore about international law. So this is the thing this is the mistake of strategic thinking. So I would like call to like international community to support those who fight for democracy, that those not only like Cambodia, but another democratic force like in Asia, like in Myanmar, like in Bangladesh or other Asian. Yeah, this is not only like Ukraine, but democracy. So democracy and national interest is different. Yeah, thank you.
Right. Any I think that was 2. Let's. Oh, is there a third one? Okay, very quick one.
Okay, right. I just want to steer the issue. My name's Noel Parker. I'm emeritus at the Institute of Political Science here, Copenhagen. I'd just like to steer the question back to inequality, the connection between inequality and democracy. And I'm going to criticise Richard Young's answer there. He responded that the West, I think, had spent too much on development aid, helping the economy. Now that seems to have missed the point. I thought it missed the point. Help to the economy funneled through the central state has increased the power. Normally, increased the power of the central state vis-à-vis the people, so compounding the problem. Since neoliberalism took over the liberal bit of liberal democracy, the problem is to rebalance the liberalism towards democracy and reinsert the equality bit of democracy, thus increasing the attraction, the effectiveness of democracy for delivering to the people. That's it.
Good. I don't know if there was a question there, but there was certainly a comment that we can leave it to Richard as well. I'm sorry that I think the Israeli-Palestinian thing is a little tricky. I was wondering just for the comment on this, the strategic thinking versus the democratic discussion. Rasmus, you seems like.
Well, I can bring in the Israeli because
Good.
Obviously, especially for the second summit, that was very contentious in the U.S. The inclusion of Israel because of the current democratic problems that they are facing. But obviously also, again, from a political perspective, Israel is kind of a no-go in the US to sort of leave out. And interestingly also, if you look at the map, the Middle East, of course, is not particularly well represented among the invitees. And so what do? You invite Israel and you invite Iraq, because you got to work with what you've got. And there the Americans have some foothold in various ways. And you also, of course, cannot only invite a Jewish state and not an Arab state. And so that is like very good example of the need to, or the decision to balance ideals with strategic interests and the need for having some participation from that region. But Israel has been very contentious, especially on the second summit here.
Right. Excellent. Richard?
I would actually say the really crucial point is here that the big priority is to give concrete, tangible support to democratic activists, to those fighting for democratic norms, and for all the value of the Summit of Democracy process. So far, it actually hasn't put new resources on the table across all the different donors and countries that have bought into the process to actually help people on the ground fighting democracy in a concrete way, which ultimately I think is more important than any number of high-level democracy summits. The point on inequality, point taken, but I also think she is talking about economic development and economic opportunity. If the big issue is the whole neoliberal model and how it has cultivated inequality, the US and the Summit for Democracy process is not going to get anywhere near dealing with those kind of power imbalances. And I still think there's an implication here that somehow international organizations have given too much importance to a direct focus on political rights rather than these issues of inequality and economics. And I still do take issue with that, because in most countries around the world, more funding has gone to issues related to economic justice and social rights than to political rights, simply because they are the really hard issues, the political rights, the really hard issues. So I would agree with you that the whole economic system needs to be looked at. But I still feel there's a slight kind of empirical imbalance in what's being claimed here. And I think you're right, it's we can't get into Israel-Palestine, but I think it does demonstrate what one of the points, at least, that I was hoping to convey, that for all the summit's undoubted value in talking about general principles of democracy and the importance of cooperation, it's got nowhere near coming to terms with concrete, tangible problems as they arise in individual countries. I would say that's what's happening with Israel-Palestine is that democratic backsliding in Israel and Palestine are both feeding into an aggravation, intensification of the conflict dynamic. So as Daniel was saying, it demonstrates you can't trade off stability for a focus on political reform and political openness. And these kind of problems are multiplying across the world. And it may be overly cynical of me, but I just can't see this summit process getting anywhere near actually dealing with these kinds of concrete problems.
Excellent. Daniel?
Thanks. I am very challenged to add anything meaningful to these 2 points. Potentially, just one thing on the inequality problem. That's definitely not only a development or democracy assistance problem. That's also at the core of guaranteeing democratic stability within the West. There is a very broad consensus in any literature focusing on the root causes of populism that it can be traced back on 3 distinct issues. One is the lack of representation. Another one is the identity clashes, and the third one is obviously the decreasing level of equality in any meaningful sense, even in the Western societies. And sooner or later, if there should be also a meaningful response to this populism challenge, it has to address the equality dimension. And I'm stating that as a wholehearted, old-fashioned liberal. So obviously, we have to bring back certain equality into the Western democracies as well, because otherwise this model will be not necessarily sustainable in the long run. Thank you.
All right, we are a little late. I apologize for that. You'll have to blame it on the moderator, but it's only because there is so much extremely interesting material to come around here. So I really want to thank the panel, Daniel, Richard, and Rasmus for coming, and you as well. So thank you very much, all of you, and hope to see you again soon here at DIIS. Thank you.